The morning in Cheyenne broke with a thin light stretched over the vast Wyoming sky, a light that belonged less to the sun and more to the restless wind that never stopped prowling the land. Dust rose in delicate veils, carried low across the earth until it clung to boots, hats, and the tired steel of the auction yard. The smell of hay and sweat and manure mixed with the sharper tang of rusted metal and the faint bitterness of coffee poured from battered thermoses. Men leaned on rails with their shoulders rounded, boots dug into the dirt, their voices running together in short exchanges about weather, prices, and cattle too stubborn to fatten this year. The air carried a hum of practical life, but beneath it ran another current, a weight that gathered itself silently as the hour drew nearer to the lot everyone waited for, yet no one wished to face. The auction had moved briskly through the early numbers. A pair of roans with steady eyes and good feet drew quick nods from men who recognized usefulness. A Palomino mare with her foal clinging to her flank brought a softened murmur from the crowd, even the hardest faces bending into small half-smiles at the sight of the new life trying its unsteady legs. Geldings went next, solid ranch horses whose value could be measured by the rhythm of their gait, the calm in their eyes, and the nods of agreement among buyers who knew they were paying for reliability rather than show. The auctioneer's patter rose and fell like a hymn everyone knew, numbers sliding effortlessly into words and back again. 4, now 5, thank you, sir, 6, sold. The rhythm kept time with the clack of the gavel, the shuffle of boots, the snap of halters changing hands. Then the yard hands moved differently. They cleared a corridor, and steel gates slammed shut with a sharper ring. The sound pulled heads up, pulled conversations shorter. This pen had been different from the start. Its rails stood higher, cross-braced with fresh timber where old posts had been tested and failed. The paint had been rubbed away in long scars where something massive had leaned, shoved, scraped, with a persistence that did not tire. 2 young men stood at either side of the gate, their clipboards held more like shields than tools, their mouths tight with the kind of caution that does not speak itself aloud but fills every breath. Lot 14, the stallion emerged from the shadow into the thin sunlight, too large for the space he occupied. 19 hands high at the withers, a body of storm-black muscle that seemed less built than forged, as though iron had melted and set in the shape of a horse. His mane fell in heavy tangles, his tail swept low with the weight of a rope meant to strike. Along his left flank stretched a scar that bore the story of a fire-hot iron, healed but etched permanently into him, a line that spoke of brutality rather than accident. He did not move restlessly the way nervous horses do. He stood with hooves planted, hindquarters gathered like a spring, neck arched in a claim that the ground itself belonged to him. When he raised his head, his eyes caught faces and held them. There was no panic there, no pleading, only a challenge, deep and dark, as if daring the crowd to test him and lose. He struck the rail once with the flat of his hoof, and the entire pen shook. Steel groaned in answer. Men who had stood too close stepped back without speaking. Someone whispered a curse. Another hissed, "Hush," in the tone used when children stray too close to something dangerous. The yard hand lifted his clipboard and read what most already knew in fragments gathered from rumor. Shire Stallion, age uncertain, likely 6. Estimated weight, 2,600 pounds. Prior owners 3, all unable to maintain. History of gait failures, history of injury to a handler. The stallion shook his head hard, mane whipping, and struck again, the rail ringing like a bell that warned instead of welcomed. "Hell of a horse," a man muttered near the front. He did not sound impressed. "Hell is proper," another answered, and the phrase carried into the crowd like a truth too bitter for humor. The auctioneer stepped onto the block. Wade Harlan had the long arms of a man who had known ranch work and the heavy slouch of one who had learned to sell it instead. His voice, when it touched the microphone, turned into gravel and smoke. He removed his hat, raked his fingers through prematurely white hair, and set the hat back on his head as though it were armor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wade began, his voice steady and carrying, "Lot 14, the biggest animal we have seen in this yard in years. I will not sweet-talk you. He is the hardest, too." No one flinched at the word. Hard was a language everyone there understood. Wade leaned forward, hat brim cutting the glare from his eyes. You buy him, you buy the whole of him. He has bone and he has drive. You know what that can mean in the right hands. You also understand what it can mean in the wrong ones. 3 sets of hands have said they had him, and none of them did. If you step up today, you step up knowing what you are walking into. He nodded toward the boys at the gate. One nudged the steel with his boot as if testing its strength. The stallion lifted his head at that faint sound and went very still, the kind of stillness that carries more danger than motion. Wade called for 1,000 to start. Nothing. The silence was not even polite. Men adjusted hats, shifted weight, cleared throats. The stallion snorted and struck again, and dust jumped from the rail. 800, Wade said, his voice quick, trying to keep the air moving. Gentlemen, this is power and bone enough to breed for years if you have the hands. Still, no answer. 600, he tried, almost cheerful. The cheer clattered hollowly in the space between words. The silence grew heavy. Somewhere, a coffee lid snapped closed. Somewhere else, boots ground into gravel. At 400, Wade's tone changed, fell flatter. Folks, you are stealing him at 4. A woman shook her head slowly, wishing she could, but knowing she could not. A man whose fortune had been made by never letting sentiment guide him tilted his hat down, a silent refusal. 300, Wade said, voice stripped of color. The clerk behind him set down his pencil and opened the folder marked for the kill buyer. Paper rasped. The stallion flicked his ear, attentive to the most minor betrayal of intent. 200. Wade sounded tired now. At 1,000, a man could imagine triumph. At 200, all a man could imagine was a bargain that carried consequences heavy as iron chains. The silence pressed harder. The crowd knew the rhythm of an ending when it arrived. The stallion blew out a sharp breath and stamped, as though sealing his fate himself. Then a voice cut through. Not loud, but steady. The kind of voice that traveled because it carried conviction instead of volume. 150. Heads turned together, searching. A man had stepped from the edge of the shade, 1 pace forward, as though answering a roll call. His clothes bore dust like it was stitched in. His jacket was worn thin at the elbows, his beard uneven, his hair unkempt. He carried a limp that made his weight shift, off one leg and then back on, deliberate, refusing the ease of favoring. His face was unremarkable except for the steadiness in his eyes that had learned to measure doorways before stepping through them, eyes that carried patience honed in places harsher than this yard. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the horse. Wade shaded his eyes and found him. "Sir, you know what you are bidding on." "I do," the man answered. He said it simply, not in bravado, not in poetry, only with the weight of someone who had already paid higher costs than money. "What is your name?" Wade asked, though procedure did not require it. "Noah Briggs." The crowd murmured. Some said he would not last a week. Some said he was asking for death. Some whispered that perhaps he thought he had a trick. Noah ignored them. He kept his eyes on the stallion, not measuring him as a breaker measuring a fight, but allowing for the possibility that the animal was looking back. Wade nodded once slowly, as if the name itself came with respect. He warned him again, but Noah's answer was plain. I see something in his eyes. The stallion stood, iron in his posture, challenge in his gaze. The crowd wanted spectacle. What they got was something else, something quiet. Wade struck the gavel. "Sold," he called. Cadence final. Lot 14 to Noah Briggs for 150. The yard exhaled relief and unease together, curiosity bitter in their throats. Paper scratched, blue carbon sheets turned, indemnities circled, signatures scrawled. The stallion struck the rail again, ringing metal bright. Noah signed where they pointed, initials tight. Wade lowered his voice, off the microphone now, and said gently, "Take all the time you need." Noah nodded. He walked to the rail, stopped 3 feet short, hands open, body quiet. The stallion swung his great head toward him, blew dust into the air, lifted his neck higher, a titan still daring. Noah did not shush or soothe. He stood, letting the wind move through him the way it moved through the grass. The stallion's ears flicked, one and then the other. Seconds stacked into long wait. Then the skull-heavy head shifted, a fraction, not toward and not away, but into a place where he could see this man with both eyes. It was nothing, it was everything. And that was how it began. The crowd lingered longer than it usually did after a sale, their boots scuffing the gravel as if reluctant to leave until they had watched the strange man and the monstrous horse face each other in the open light. Some shook their heads, muttering that Noah Briggs was finished before he had even started. Others laughed bitterly, predicting broken bones before the week was out. But a few, the kind who had lived long enough to see odd fates take root, stayed silent and narrowed their eyes, curious about what would follow. The clerk pressed the final papers into Noah's hand and retreated with relief, as though distance itself was protection. Wade Harlan, who had seen more men by their own ruin than he could count, stood by with his hat lowered against the sun, watching carefully. He had warned Noah, but there was something in the man's manner that kept him from repeating it. The stallion, black as a thunderhead, pawed the ground once, sharp enough to send a spark of dust into the air. The crowd began to thin, murmurs trailing away like threads of smoke, until Noah was left nearly alone with the animal that seemed far too large for any pen. The driver brought the trailer around, its tires crunching loudly on gravel, the metal sides groaning in protest as if already afraid of its cargo. He leaned out the window, chewing the last of his cigarette, and eyed the stallion with the wary glance of a man who had hauled everything from stubborn mules to bulls too mean to keep. "You sure you want him in my rig?" he asked. Noah only nodded once. The driver spat into the dirt, muttered something about men with death wishes, and climbed down to help. The loading was its own battle. The stallion resisted the ramp as though the earth itself would betray him if his hooves left it. He blew out sharp and loud, his neck arched, his muscles bunched. The boards rattled under his weight when he finally surged forward, half a lunge and half a dare, but Noah did not flinch. He stood aside, one hand open at his side, the other steady on the rail. The giant beast thundered past him into the narrow space of the trailer, stamping once in fury before stilling. The driver slammed the gate and leaned against it, wiping sweat from his brow, though the morning was still cool. The ride back to Noah's land was long enough for silence to settle in the cab. The driver, a man named Joel, who had carried animals all his life, kept his eyes on the road, but spoke with the slow drawl of one who weighed words carefully. "A man told me at the yard that this one's hell on gates. Watch your knees, they do not grow back." Noah gave a faint nod, his jaw tightening as if remembering injuries already earned elsewhere. "I will watch," he said simply. The land Noah called his own was not much to look at. Patches of old fence leaned tiredly into the wind, and a shed roof had half surrendered to the last storm that passed. Grass grew in sparse tufts, and dust lay in shallow drifts against the posts. But it was his, and that was enough. Joel pulled the rig to the makeshift gate and killed the engine. He looked at the land, then at the man beside him, and shook his head slightly. "You are on your own here, Briggs." Noah's limp was more noticeable when he stepped down from the truck, the weight of his purchase making each step heavier. He moved with the stubborn patience of one who had learned to live with pain rather than yield to it. At the back of the trailer, the stallion was already slamming against the divider, the sound ringing like hammer strikes. Noah waited, one hand on the latch, his chest rising slow and steady. He knew the animal could break him if he misjudged even a moment, but he opened the gate anyway. The black giant burst out, stumbling half a step before regaining his balance, with the dignity of a fallen boulder righting itself. He shot to the far corner of the pen Noah had built from scavenged wood and braced steel, testing each line with fury. Shoulders pressed against the rails until bolts groaned. His nostrils flared wide, his ears swiveling at every sound the land offered. He circled tight, kicking dust into the air until the world seemed to shrink to the violent shape of his body. "Water is there," Noah said, his chin tilting toward the trough. "Feed when you are ready." He spoke without raising his voice, each word plain, without command and without plea. The stallion ignored him, driving his chest against a post until the brace sang like a struck bell. But when the dust cleared, His eyes flicked back once toward the man who stood quietly at the center, hands open, as though declaring he carried nothing but time. By nightfall, the pen bore its first scars. A post bent a degree off-center, planks sprung from their nails, and a steel feed pan crumpled like paper. Noah repaired them with a lantern light, his hands moving slowly but precisely, and each strike of the hammer was a conversation between wood and metal. The horse watched, unblinking, from the far side of the pen, his breath rising in clouds that caught the dim glow. Every strike of Noah's hammer echoed like a challenge, and every silence between was an answer the horse seemed to measure. Sleep came lightly and shallowly. The wind carried the sharp ring of hoof on steel into the small hours, jolting Noah awake again and again. Each time he stepped outside, boots half on, the stallion stood calm and still, as if cataloging his own power with patience rather than frenzy. The man could feel it, that this was not chaos but calculation, as though the animal were probing the world for its weaknesses and taking notes. At dawn, Noah set his tools to work again. The pen had to be strengthened, rails dug deeper into clay, and braces doubled where the horse leaned hardest. His hands blistered, but he worked without complaint. As he set a new beam into place, he spoke aloud to himself, the way a man might when silence grows too large. The horse is not malicious. The horse is a horse. The rhythm of the words carried him through the hours, steadying the anger that flickered when boards snapped under strain. For 3 days, this became the pattern. By evening, the stallion had escaped twice, once through a latch that should not have yielded, once over a rail too high to imagine him clearing. Both times, Noah tracked him across the property, his heart pounding at the thought of what damage the animal could wreak if he crossed the wrong fence line. Both times the stallion allowed himself to be turned without charge. Contempt in the snort of his breath, but obedience, grudging and strange in his steps. At the end of the third night, Noah leaned against a post, his forehead pressed to the cool wood. He had not spoken the word mistake aloud, but it hovered over him as precise and ready as a nail over a board. His hands ached, his leg throbbed, his chest carried the heavy press of doubt. And still the stallion stood across the pen, unbroken, unyielding, but watching, always watching. Noah's mind reached back to years gone by, to orders barked across desert air, to doors kicked open in towns that hated his presence, to friends carried out under flags. He remembered the nights when the world seemed too sharp to survive, when anger was the only rope keeping him from falling. He saw something of that same anger standing before him now, not in a man, but in a creature too wild for chains and too strong for cages. He limped closer to the rail, stopping 3 feet short as he always did. His hands stayed open at his sides. The stallion turned his head, ears flicking, and met his gaze. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Noah spoke, his voice low but steady, the same way he had spoken when giving commands that men were expected to follow into the fire. Not forever, he told the horse, just until we both know better. The stallion blew out sharply, a snort that lifted dust from the ground. His ears flicked once more, then settled. He bent his head to the hay, tearing at it in heavy pulls, not because it had been offered, but because hunger finally demanded it. Noah turned away, his limp heavy, but for the first time since the gavel had fallen, the weight in his chest eased by a fraction. The days ahead would not grow easier. He knew that. The horse would test every brace, break every weakness, measure every word and silence. But Noah also knew something else, something he had not spoken aloud. In the black storm of the stallion's eyes, he had glimpsed a reflection of his own, and that was a reason not to quit. The nights grew restless on Noah Briggs's land. Sleep was a shallow thing, thin as glass, and it broke at the slightest sound of steel groaning under hooves. Each crack of impact carried through the wind, jolting Noah awake, his body snapping upright before his mind caught up. Outside, lantern light threw weak arcs against the pen where the stallion raged and tested every corner, every brace, every nail. The beast was not frantic, not a prisoner clawing at walls, but a tactician probing weaknesses, cataloging them with patient fury. Noah came to know the rhythm of destruction. The heavy stamp meant a rail had been bent an inch. The quick double kick against steel meant a bolt was ready to loosen. The deep snort that came after, not of exhaustion but of assessment, as if the horse were recording the progress of his campaign. By dawn, the pen was scarred and Noah's hands were raw from mending. The animal slept only in stolen minutes, standing tall in the shadows, ears twitching, eyes never dulled. Neighbors drove by slower than before, slowing enough to catch sight of the black mountain within the pen. Some shook their heads and spat in the dirt as they passed, muttering to themselves that Briggs had bought his death for a pitiful sum. A few laughed under their breath, calling it entertainment they did not have to pay for. But others watched longer, silent, uneasy, as if they were seeing a story unfold that did not belong to them, yet held them anyway. By the fourth day, the pen bore signs of siege. Posts dug deep into clay now leaned at odd angles, chains rattled with each collision, and braces cracked along the grain. Noah mended what he could with scavenged lumber and iron rods, his limp worsening with each hour of labor. Still, he worked without complaint, his jaw set, his eyes darkened with a stubbornness older than his wounds. He remembered deserts where orders had chained him harder than iron, nights when rage was the only company he had, and he knew that quitting was not in his vocabulary. On the fifth evening, when the wind dragged clouds heavy with rain across the horizon, the stallion finally did something new. He stood still. Not the stillness of calculation, but of endurance. His chest heaved, breath visible in the cool dusk, but his hooves did not strike. Noah stood at the rail, 3 feet back as always, and for the first time, he let himself speak more than a sentence. "I know what it feels like to live inside anger," he said quietly, the words rising with the wind. "To let it build walls until you forget what the world looked like before." His voice carried, not for the horse but for himself, and yet he kept his gaze fixed on the dark eyes across from him. The stallion flicked his ears forward, then back, a gesture small enough to miss if a man had come looking for miracles. Rain broke over the land in cold sheets. The stallion turned his head against it, his mane plastered to his neck. Noah stood in it, letting the water soak him until his clothes clung to his body and the earth softened under his boots. He did not move, did not flinch, only stayed, showing the horse that storms could be endured without violence. Hours later, when the rain thinned and the clouds gave way to a pale moon, the stallion lowered his head a fraction, not in surrender, but in recognition. Noah saw it and let the moment pass without claiming it. The following morning, Noah filled a bucket at the spigot, the metal handle cold in his hand. He walked the long lane with steady steps, careful not to scuff gravel, careful to let the rhythm of his movement be calm. At the gap in the rail, he slid the bucket through and stepped back. He did not speak. He only sat on a cottonwood stump nearby, his elbows resting on his knees, his breath even. The stallion approached the bucket slowly, his ears twitching, his nostrils flaring as though the water carried secrets. He drank with great pulls, the sound of it loud in the morning stillness. Then he lifted his head, water dripping from his muzzle, and turned to look directly at the man who had waited. Noah said nothing, his body a quiet shape against the pale sky. The stallion's gaze held him, deep and unreadable, before shifting away to the horizon. That was when Noah knew. The horse was no longer only measuring the pen, he was measuring him. The days wove themselves into a rhythm, sharp and delicate. Morning water, evening hay, Noah sitting silent at the stump. The stallion's violence dulled, not vanished but redirected, his strikes fewer, his escapes less frequent. He still tested the rails, but he tested Noah too, watching for movement, for reaction, for cracks in the man's patience. Each time Noah stayed steady, each time he refused to raise his voice or rush forward, something subtle shifted. The air grew less taut, the silence less brittle. On the 9th day, Noah carried the bucket as usual, but instead of stopping at the stump, he took 2 steps further. Not bold, not reckless, only deliberate. His boots settled softly in the dirt. The stallion flared his nostrils once, ears twitching, but did not retreat. Noah stopped there, still outside the circle of danger, and waited. Minutes passed. The wind carried the faint cry of a hawk overhead. The stallion shifted his weight, his muscles rolling under black hide, but his head did not turn away. Noah felt the tension inside his own chest loosen, just enough to allow the smallest breath of relief. He said nothing, for he had learned long ago that some victories are broken when named too soon. That night, under the thin glow of lantern light, Noah sat on the porch, his legs stretched out, aching more than usual. His hands were raw, his shoulders tight, his body worn by labor and vigilance. Yet in his chest something new had taken root, fragile but steady. The stallion was still wild, still dangerous, but he had begun to see. And for a man who had lived too long inside his own walls of anger, that was enough to keep working. The storm inside the fences was not over. It might never be, but Noah understood it now. The horse was not simply fighting him, he was fighting the world that had shaped him into a creature of scars and fury. And Noah, scarred in his own ways, knew that battle too well to walk away. So he stayed, he mended, he waited, and the storm waited with him. Dawn settled across the Wyoming plain with a cold sharpness that cut through the lungs. The horizon bled orange and pale gold, but the light carried little warmth. Noah Briggs rose from his cot before the rooster crowed, boots laced tight though the stiffness in his legs screamed against every movement. The night had been thin with sleep again, broken by the sounds of steel under siege. The stallion had battered the rails until the echoes shook the boards loose from their nails. When Noah stepped into the yard, the animal stood there like a shadow forged from storm, his head high, his eyes bright, his chest still heaving from the long fight with fences that had not given way. The pen bore scars as though a battle had been waged inside it. Posts leaned, bolts sagged, and the ground itself carved into trenches by hooves pounding against it. Noah stopped 3 feet short of the rail as he always did. His breath steadied, his eyes fixed on the black shape that refused to be small. The stallion stared back with the same dare, a gaze too heavy to be dismissed. The distance between them held not just space but history. Noah saw in that look something he knew too well, the coiled rage of a soul that had never been offered reason to trust. He leaned on the post, testing its wobble, and muttered softly to himself, "We will build it stronger." His voice carried no demand, only recognition. The morning became labor. Noah sank new posts into the earth, deeper this time, hammering through clay until his shoulders burned. He scavenged iron rods, welding braces until sparks bit his hands. Sweat stung his eyes, but he did not stop. The stallion watched from across the pen, ears twitching, body still except for the occasional stamp against the ground. It was not malice, Noah told himself as he worked, not cruelty. The horse was not a monster. He was what the world had made him. By afternoon, clouds gathered low and heavy. The smell of rain pushed ahead of them, iron and wet sage mixing with dust. The wind rose sharply, and with it, the stallion's restlessness grew. He circled the pen in tight arcs, nostrils wide, tail lashing, as though the storm in the sky had stirred its brother inside him. Noah stood by the gate, his body calm, his voice low, easy. The word was little more than breath, yet it carried. The horse stopped, ears forward, eyes locked. That was the first fracture of silence. The stallion did not bolt. He did not strike the rail. He stood, sides heaving, his gaze fixed on the man who had not flinched. For the first time since Noah had brought him home, there was a pause that felt like more than exhaustion. It was small, invisible to anyone else, but Noah saw it. In the stillness of that breath, the war had shifted. The storm broke fast. Lightning ripped across the sky, thunder rolled in long and deep, and rain poured in sheets heavy enough to blur the edges of the land. Noah stayed by the rail, soaked to the bone, his leg trembling under his weight. The stallion thundered along the fence line, running circles as if chased by ghosts only he could see. Mud churned under his hooves, spray rising with each strike. But each time he neared the gate where Noah stood, he slowed a fraction, his eyes cutting toward the man, as if measuring his stillness against the violence in the sky. Hours dragged, the shed roof rattled, bolts moaned, trees clawed at the wind. The stallion slowed at last, his head lowering, his body shuddering from the storm within and without. He stopped in the far corner, water running in rivulets down his black hide, and looked again toward Noah. Not away, not past him, at him. Noah let his hands rest open at his sides. He did not move closer, did not demand. He only stood in the rain, as steady as the posts he had driven into the earth that morning. When the stallion finally blew out, a long breath sent mist into the air. It was not defiance but release. Noah whispered, almost to himself, "We can outlast this." When dawn returned, pale and weary, the storm had gone, leaving the ground soaked and scarred. Noah's land looked battered, his fences sagging, his shed roof half torn. But inside the pen, something had shifted. The stallion stood with his head lower, ears not pinned but listening. His eyes carried the same fire, yet behind it lay a glimmer of recognition. Noah stepped to the rail, slid the bucket through and waited. The stallion approached, slow and cautious, his hooves sinking in the mud. He drank, lifting his head to look at the man once more, water dripping from his muzzle. The silence that followed was not the brittle silence of challenge, but the fragile quiet of something waiting to grow. It was not yet, not forgiveness, but it was a beginning, carved out of storms and stubbornness, a first fracture in the wall that had held both of them for far too long. And Noah, scarred and limping but unyielding, knew he would stay until the fracture widened into something more. The morning after the storm carried a strange calm across Noah Briggs's land. The air smelled of sage, washed clean, and the soil still drank the rain, leaving the ground dark and heavy underfoot. The fences glistened with drops, and the battered shed leaned but still stood, its roof torn in jagged places where the wind had clawed at it. In the far pen, the stallion stood with his head lifted and ears pricked, watching the horizon as though the storm had been a test. He was waiting to see if another would come. Noah moved slowly, his limp deeper after the labor and the sleepless night. His body ached in every joint, his legs screamed with each step, yet he carried the bucket as he always did, steady and quiet. The stallion tracked him with dark eyes, following his movement without shifting his weight. Noah slid the bucket through the gap, stepped back, and settled onto the stump he had claimed as his place of waiting. The horse approached the water without hesitation this time. He drank, the sound loud in the silence, then raised his head and fixed his gaze on the man sitting still. It was a small thing, no more than a glance that lingered, but it felt like a word spoken between them in a language without sound. Noah let it pass, neither reaching forward nor claiming victory, only meeting the gaze with the steadiness of someone who knew the cost of rushing. By mid-morning, a truck rolled up the lane, its tires spraying mud from the softened ground. Dust would have followed on a dry day, but today the road smelled of wet earth. Noah straightened from the post he was bracing and wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The door creaked open, and a man stepped down, hat low, shoulders squared. It was Bo Kincaid, one of the stallion's former owners. His boots sank into the mud as he walked, his face carved deep with lines of bitterness and sleepless nights. He stopped at the fence and leaned his weight against it, his eyes fixed on the black horse that stood motionless in the far corner. "Thought you would be smart enough not to be this dumb," Bo said, his voice flat and hard. Noah did not answer at once. He watched the horse, then turned his eyes back to Bo. "You had him," Noah said. "Had him like a tornado," Bo answered. "It comes through, tears up what it wants, and when it leaves, you count the damage." His jaw tightened as though a memory still hurt him. "That one will kill you before he gives you an ounce of trust." "Ask me how I know." "How do you know?" Noah asked quietly. Bo let out a humorless laugh. 3 cracked ribs, 20 feet of pipe rail torn out, and a ranch hand who swore he would never step on my land again. "That horse is a curse. Sell him. Put him on the truck that ends him. There is no shame in knowing where the line is." Noah's mouth went into a thin line. His voice was steady when he spoke. "I appreciate the warning." Bo shook his head. "Then you had better start praying." He turned, mud sucking at his boots, and climbed back into his truck. Dustless, the engine grumbled away, leaving behind only the echo of his words and the uneasy silence that followed. Noah stood a long while at the fence, his hand resting against the damp wood. The stallion had not moved during Bo's speech, He stood as though carved from stone, watching, listening. Noah wondered if the animal understood more than men gave him credit for, if the memory of harsh hands and broken trust lingered in him like scars that never healed. That evening, Noah sat on his porch, the weight of Bo's warning pressing on him like the storm clouds had pressed the night before. The sun sank low, staining the hills in red and gold. His body was heavy, his leg throbbing, but his mind would not rest. He thought of the moment at the auction when the stallion had shifted his head to see him with both eyes. He thought of the storm, when the great beast had slowed at the gate rather than fleeing outright. He thought of the long silence that had cracked, just enough to let a new kind of stillness through. From the pen came the steady rhythm of hoof on packed earth, not frantic, not violent, but deliberate. The stallion moved along the fence line, circling as though marking the ground, each step a statement. Noah watched from the porch, his hands folded together, the ache in his chest sharper than the ache in his leg. He knew the math of warnings and of risk. $150 had bought him a story no one believed he could finish. It had also bought him a reflection of his own anger, and perhaps a reason not to quit. He whispered into the quiet, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "I am not ready to give up on you." The night took the words and did not return them. But from the far end of the pen, the stallion blew out through his nostrils, the sound heavy and low, like an unspoken reply. Noah leaned back against the porch post, his eyes closing for a moment. He thought of wars fought far from this land, of nights when fear had been the only companion, of mornings when he had risen only because the weight of duty forced him to. This was different and yet the same. Another battle, another reason to keep standing when others would walk away. The stallion had his scars, and Noah had his own. Both of them had been written off more than once. Both of them had been called broken, dangerous, and unfit for trust. But Noah had seen something in the horse's eyes that mirrored the truth he carried deep within himself. That was enough. The wind shifted, cool and clean after the storm. The fences creaked in the night air. The house behind him settled with small noises, wood turning, nails sighing. Noah sat long into the darkness, his gaze fixed on the shadow moving steadily in the pen. The warnings hung heavy, but so did the hope. And hope, he knew, had never been a sensible currency, but it was the only one worth carrying. The morning came with a thin frost glittering on the ground, a reminder that Wyoming's seasons turned quickly, sometimes cruelly. Noah Briggs woke stiff, his joints aching from labor, and his leg burning with its familiar complaint. The scars of war never let him forget themselves, not in sleep and not in waking. Yet as he pulled on his boots and stepped into the brittle air, his eyes went immediately to the pen. The black stallion stood there, unmoving but watchful, as if he had been waiting through the night. The pen bore fresh wounds from the battles of the previous day. A rail leaned inward at a dangerous angle. Bolts groaned under strain, and mud stamped deep told the story of a creature who had tested every weakness. But the animal had not escaped. He had chosen to remain inside, though the fence no longer deserved to contain him. That choice mattered to Noah more than the broken wood. It meant something, though what, he did not yet dare to name. He carried the bucket as he always did, the handle cutting into his calloused palm. His limp was pronounced today, every step echoing the damage he had learned to live with. He slid the water through the gap, then stepped back, breathing steady, waiting. The stallion approached with the slow, measured grace of a predator, every muscle alive, every step a question. He lowered his head and drank, but this time, when he finished, he did not turn away. He kept his eyes on Noah, the frost on his muzzle catching the pale light. For long moments, man and horse watched each other. Neither moved. The silence stretched thin, but it was no longer brittle. It carried weight, like a rope strung between them. Noah's heart thudded once, twice, and then he spoke. "I will not quit on you." The words hung in the cold air, a promise whispered into the space where trust might someday grow. The stallion flicked an ear, then blew out softly, a breath that misted between them. It was not acceptance, not yet. But it was not defiance either. It was the most minor shift, and Noah felt it settle deep inside him, like the first warmth of fire in a frozen room. By afternoon, word had traveled. It always did. A truck pulled up, carrying Hank Morrison, another of the horse's former owners. Hank's face was red with windburn and years of hard labor. His eyes narrowed under the brim of his hat. He climbed down slowly, leaning on the door as if considering whether it was worth speaking. "You think you are different," Hank said flatly. His voice carried bitterness, but behind it was something else. Fear, maybe, or regret. "That horse will break you. He broke better men than you." Noah did not rise to the bait. He leaned against the fence, his hand resting lightly on the wood, and looked at Hank. "Maybe, but he is still here." Hank barked a laugh that held no humor for now. "I had him for 21 days. Cost me 3 hospital visits and a man who never came back to work. That horse is a devil." Noah's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. Maybe he just needed someone to stay long enough. Hank spat into the dirt and shook his head. "Or maybe you are too stubborn to know when to walk away. Either way you will learn the hard way." He turned, climbed into his truck, and drove off, leaving behind a trail of exhaust and words that clung like burrs. Noah stayed by the fence long after the truck was gone. The stallion had not moved, his dark eyes watching, his ears flicking. Noah wondered if the horse understood, if he could sense the weight of old hands that had struck, old voices that had cursed him. He whispered into the cold, not for Hank, not for the world, but for the animal standing silent before him. "I will not be another ghost in your memory." That night, the wind carried new sounds. The stallion did not rage against the rails. He moved more slowly, pacing, his hooves dragging lines into the mud like deliberate riding. Noah watched from the porch, his breath clouding in the chill. He knew patience was a fragile thing, that trust was built not by force but by repetition, by the steady presence of someone who would not leave. He had seen it in war, in the way men leaned on each other when the world went dark. He had seen it in himself, in the way scars turned into strength when time allowed. And now he saw it here, in the black giant who still tested every shadow, but who had not walked away when he could have. The stallion was not ready to surrender. Neither was Noah. But for the first time, they stood on the same edge, staring at it together. The night grew deep, and Noah sat with the weight of that thought pressing warm against the cold air. The storm had not ended, the battle had not been won, but the silence had cracked, and in that fracture lay the shape of something new, something worth staying for. The Wyoming sun rose pale and cold, stretching light across the battered fences and the soaked ground that still bore the scars of storms. Noah Briggs moved with his usual limp down the lane, a bucket in hand, his breath clouding in the chill. The stallion stood in the far corner, black as iron against the dawn, his body motionless except for the flick of his ears. Noah set the bucket down just inside the gap in the rail and stepped back, his boots sinking in mud. He lowered himself onto the cottonwood stump, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving the animal. The stallion approached with slow deliberation, each step sounding louder than it should have in the morning quiet. He bent to drink, his sides rising and falling like the steady bellows of a forge. This had become their rhythm. Silence, waiting, watching. Yet today the silence carried something different. Not the brittle weight of danger, but the slow stretch of possibility. Noah let it linger, his chest tightening with the recognition that he had begun to wait not just for safety, but for change. The day warmed by degrees. Noah mended fence posts with careful hands, his shoulders aching, his leg trembling each time he drove the hammer. The stallion shadowed his movements from the other side of the rail, not close, not friendly, but present. When Noah paused, wiping sweat from his brow, the horse lowered his head to graze on what grass pushed through the mud. That simple act felt like permission. By mid-afternoon, a familiar truck appeared on the road. Its engine coughed as it pulled into the yard, and Maggie Torres stepped out, her veterinary kit slung over one shoulder. She closed the door with a soft thud and leaned on the fence, her eyes sweeping across the pen. "You bought yourself trouble," she said without accusation, only with the steady tone of someone who had seen worse in barns and fields. "Looks like," Noah answered. She watched the stallion for a long moment, her body quiet, her presence calm. The animal did not turn away, did not charge. He watched her back, his eyes sharp, unblinking. Maggie tilted her head, noting details silently. "His shoulders are good," she said finally. "He is too good for what he has been through. He is either too harsh to show pain or too used to it to care. "Can you get near him?" Noah asked. "Not without forcing what should not be moved," she replied, "and I will not dart him for curiosity. His eyes are telling me more than any scan would." "What are they telling you?" "That people were the problem, and the solution has not yet been found." Her words sank into Noah like stones into deep water. He looked at the stallion again, at the thick neck, the scarred flank, the eyes that refused to soften. He saw not just danger there, but history. Maggie left him with instructions Noah already knew in his bones. Time, consistency, no point to prove, no hunger for a story. Be there, feed when you feed, water when you water, let him decide if he wants to be there too. She closed her kit and gave him a look that was neither pity nor admiration, only the acknowledgement of someone who knew how long roads could be. After she left, the yard felt different. Her words had settled in the air, mingling with the sound of the stallion's steady breath. Noah stayed by the rail longer than usual, his hands resting on the wood. The horse turned his head slightly, one ear cocked toward him, and in that slight shift, Noah felt the first brush of something fragile. Not trust, not yet, but attention, uncoerced, freely given. As evening fell, the land glowed with the colors of fire. The stallion moved along the fence line, slower than before, his steps deliberate. Noah stood still, every muscle tense with patience. When the animal stopped within 10 feet of him, head high, eyes fixed, Noah did not move. He let the air between them stay heavy, let the silence speak. Then, as if some decision had been reached deep within the horse, he exhaled. A long, heavy breath that rose in mist and drifted toward Noah. The sound was low, not challenge, not rage, but release. Noah's throat tightened, his hands flexed against the rail, but he held his place. The stallion lowered his head an inch, then turned away, walking back into the shadow. It was nothing, and yet it was more than Noah had dared to expect. A fracture widened. The first touch of fire becomes warmth instead of destruction. That night, Noah sat on the porch long after the land had gone dark. He thought of Maggie's words, of Hank's warnings, of the scars both horse and man carried. He thought of battles fought far from here, where trust had been rarer than water. And he thought of the breath that had drifted across the cold evening, a sound that had reached him deeper than any voice. He whispered into the night, soft enough that only the wind might carry it. "We are getting there." From the pen came the faint sound of hooves shifting, then stillness. The horse did not answer, not in words, but Noah knew. The silence was different now. It held weight. It held promise, and he would not let it break. The Wyoming evening bled into shadow with a swiftness that left little warning. One moment, the sky burned with streaks of gold, the next it dulled to ash, with clouds gathering heavy and low as though conspiring with the earth. Noah Briggs leaned on the fence, his weight shifting to ease the ache in his leg, his eyes fixed on the black stallion within the pen. The horse moved in slow circles, head high, ears swiveling, a sentinel guarding his own fortress. The day had carried a quiet unlike the others before it. The stallion had tested the rails, but only half-heartedly, as though his strength was conserved for something larger. He had grazed, he had drunk. He had stood in the sun without breaking into fury. Noah had taken it as a sign, a fragile gift, and he had allowed himself to believe that trust might finally be within reach. But as the light drained from the sky, the air thickened. The smell of ozone drifted in sharp as metal, and the wind shifted with the restless hunger of something larger than weather. Noah had lived enough nights under hostile skies to know when danger approached. He limped back toward the house, lantern in one hand, but his eyes never left the pen. The first crack of thunder shook the ground like artillery. The stallion's head snapped up, ears pinned, muscles tightening in a wave that traveled down his body. Lightning split the horizon, painting the field in harsh white for a blink. When the darkness returned, the stallion was already running. His hooves pounded mud into spray, his body carving tight arcs along the perimeter, every turn sharper than the last. "Easy," Noah called, though his voice was nearly swallowed by the wind. He leaned against the fence, lantern swinging, refusing to retreat even as rain began to fall in sharp, slanting sheets. The stallion barreled past him, so close the ground trembled under Noah's boots, yet the man did not move away. He stood steady, the way he had in deserts when everything screamed to run. A sudden gust tore loose the weakened roof of the shed. Wood groaned, nails screamed, and the structure collapsed in a burst of splinters. One heavy beam slammed down across the fence, bending steel, snapping posts, sending a shock of sound across the yard. Noah staggered forward, instinct stronger than pain, but too late. The stallion had found the opening. The black giant surged through the gap, a blur of muscle and fury against the storm. For a heartbeat, Noah thought he would vanish into the darkness, a shadow reclaimed by the wild. His heart clenched with a pain sharper than the wound in his leg, the certainty that all he had worked for was lost in the chaos of thunder and rain. But then, the impossible happened. The stallion stopped. Not far from the break, his hooves skidded in the mud, his body twisted, and with a violent snort he wheeled back. He turned toward Noah, not the open field, not freedom. His eyes locked onto the man through the sheets of rain. For the first time, it was not a challenge that burned there. It was a decision. Noah stumbled to the broken beam, his hands gripping the slick wood, his leg buckling under the weight. He tried to drag it, but the storm mocked his strength. The stallion thundered forward, head low, shoulders bunching. For an instant, Noah thought the beast meant to trample him, but instead, the horse struck the beam with his chest again and again until the sodden wood cracked and shifted. Noah pulled, the stallion shoved, and together they forced the ruin aside. Pain lit Noah's body like fire, but he felt the air shift. The storm still raged, but the battle had changed. He leaned against the fence, gasping, water pouring from his hair and beard, his legs screaming. The stallion stood beside him, nostrils flaring, breath hot even in the cold rain. "Good boy," Noah rasped, the words nearly lost to thunder. The stallion did not rear, did not strike. He lowered his head an inch, just enough that his breath mingled with the man's. They stood like that until the storm began to pass. Two battered soldiers holding ground against a night that had tried to break them both. When dawn came, gray and fragile, the yard bore scars deeper than any storm before. But the stallion no longer looked at Noah with fury. His eyes were still fierce, still wild, but something had shifted in them. Recognition, connection, the edge of surrender. And Noah, soaked, broken, but unyielding, knew that this night had carved a bond no man could have forced, and no storm could erase. The storm had left its mark on everything. The land lay strewn with broken branches, twisted fence posts and roof shingles, scattered like cards dealt by a careless hand. Mud streaked the ground in deep channels where water had rushed, and the air carried the damp weight of earth still soaked to its bones. But none of it held Noah Briggs's eyes. His gaze stayed on the black stallion, the beast who had not run into the wild, who had turned back when freedom was within reach, who had thrown his strength against wood and storm to stand with him in the night. The stallion's body bore no visible wound from the battle, but Noah knew better. He recognized the way the animal shifted his weight, as though cataloging pain but refusing to reveal it. He had seen soldiers walk off battlefields with holes in their flesh and steel in their eyes, unwilling to admit weakness, even to themselves. The stallion was no different. Noah stepped into the yard with careful movements, his legs stiff, every muscle aching from labor and from the weight of that collapsing beam. He carried no bucket, no rope, only his own presence. He walked to the edge of the pen, the mud sucking at his boots, and leaned against the rail. The stallion stood near the center, ears twitching, nostrils flaring at the faint scent of ash left behind by lightning. Their eyes met across the distance, and something unspoken passed between them. "You saved me," Noah whispered, though the storm carried his words away. The stallion blew out a breath, hot mist curling into the cold morning, and lowered his head to the ground. It was not a submission, it was not a defeat. It was simply honesty, the kind that animals offer without ceremony. The days that followed were not easy. They never were. But they were different. The stallion no longer struck the rails with the same relentless fury. He paced, he watched, he tested, but his violence had dulled to patience, as though some part of his war had already been fought. Noah tended the fences with steadier hands, his body still aching but his spirit more constant than it had been in years. The storm had torn more than wood, it had cracked something open between them. On the fourth morning, when Noah brought the water, the stallion approached without hesitation. His head lowered into the bucket, and when he lifted it again, his muzzle dripped silver in the early sun. Noah extended his hand, palm open, hovering above the rail. The horse did not strike, did not turn away. He stepped closer, the ground trembling beneath his weight, and exhaled against Noah's skin. Warm breath, damp whiskers, a single touch that was nothing and yet everything. Noah let his fingers brush the thick hide of the neck, light as a breeze. Beneath his hand, he felt not just strength but heat, a steady pulse. The life of a creature who had been written off as savage. His throat tightened. He thought of scars hidden under flesh, of wounds that never quite closed, of nights when silence pressed too heavy to bear. He thought of his own rage, of the men he had lost, of the walls he had built inside himself to keep from breaking. And he understood. The stallion lifted his head, eyes meeting his, and Noah saw it there, the scar beneath the hide. It was not a mark on the flesh, but on the spirit, the same scar he carried. They were both creatures of war, shaped by violence, mistrust, and survival. But scars did not always mean endings. Sometimes they meant beginnings. That evening, as the sun sank into fire along the horizon, Noah sat on the porch and watched the stallion graze. His leg throbbed, his hands ached, but his chest carried a warmth he had not felt in years. The horse was still wild, still dangerous, still a storm-given flesh. But he was no longer only that. He was possibility. He was proof that scars, no matter how deep, could become more than reminders of pain. Noah whispered into the dusk, a vow carried softly on the wind. "We will find a way." The stallion raised his head, tail flicking, and for a heartbeat, his eyes softened. It was not trust, not yet, but it was something. A scar becomes strength. A storm is becoming calm. And Noah knew he would not stop until that scar turned into something both of them could finally live with. The Wyoming sky opened wide with a pale light, thin as parchment, stretching across the ridges of land that still carried scars from the storm. Noah Briggs stood at the edge of the porch, his weight balanced against the post, his leg aching from another night of restless sleep. His eyes, however, were not dulled. They searched the far pen where the black stallion stood, steady and silent, the ground beneath him carved with deep prints of restless hooves. Something had changed since that night of reckoning. The horse no longer wore his fury-like armor, and it no longer struck rails with the ceaseless rhythm of defiance. He still carried the storm in his body, but it was quieter, turned inward, coiled like a spring waiting to decide whether to strike or to release. Noah felt the same shift inside himself. For years, he had lived with anger as a companion, a shield against the world. Now he found himself listening to silence, measuring each breath not as a threat, but as an offering. That morning, he carried hay into the pen, not just slid through the gap, not tossed from the outside, but carried in. The stallion lifted his head as Noah unlatched the gate, ears pricking, nostrils flaring. Noah stepped inside slowly, his movements deliberate, each footfall set firm into the mud. He carried no rope, no stick, only the flake of hay in his arms, and the patience of a man who had decided he would not turn back. The stallion's eyes followed him, black as coal, unblinking. Noah set the hay down halfway between himself and the far side, then backed away 3 careful steps. He did not look directly at the horse but kept his gaze soft, steady, waiting. Minutes stretched like hours. The stallion shifted, muscles rolling under his hide, his body tense with decision. Then, with a single step that felt like thunder, he moved forward. Noah held his breath as the stallion reached the hay, lowered his head, and began to eat. The sound of tearing stalks filled the space between them. It was ordinary, unremarkable, Yet it was everything. Noah stayed where he was, hands loose at his sides, chest tight with something that was not fear, but a weight heavier than fear, relief perhaps, or awe. When the stallion finished, he lifted his head again, strands of hay clinging to his muzzle. His eyes found Noah across the pen. This time he did not turn away. He took one step closer, then another, until only a few feet separated them. Noah did not reach out. He did not push. He simply waited. The horse stretched his neck, nostrils flaring, breath hot against Noah's chest. The man could feel it, a living heat, raw and wild. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hand, not to grasp, not to command, only to offer. The stallion's muzzle brushed his palm, whiskers stiff and damp, a touch as fleeting as smoke. Noah felt it like fire, a brand pressed into his soul. He whispered then, voice low, almost trembling, "Valor." The name rose into the morning air, simple and sure, carrying not just hope, but a promise. The stallion flicked an ear, then let out a breath that rattled deep in his chest. He did not bolt, he did not strike, he stayed. From that day, the measure of trust became their shared language. Small things, almost invisible to anyone else, grew into milestones. A head lowered instead of raised in defiance, ears turning toward Noah's voice rather than flattening in rage. Steps are taken not away but forward, tentative and questioning. Neighbors came and watched from the road, their eyes wide with disbelief. Word spread in town, twisted in retellings until the story grew beyond truth. They said the devil horse had chosen a master, that the veteran had whispered some secret spell, that scars spoke to scars in ways no one else could understand. Noah paid no mind. He knew the truth. Trust was not magic. It was repetition, presence and patience carved day by day until it stood like stone. But he also knew trust could be broken in an instant. And so he moved carefully, never rushing, never demanding. Every morning and every evening he carried feed, water, and time. He let silence do the work words could not. He let the stallion decide when to step closer, when to breathe against his hand, when to allow the brush of fingers against his hide. Each day, another thread was added to the rope between them, fragile, thin, but growing stronger with use. Noah felt it tightening inside himself too, pulling him back from the edge he had lived on for so long. He had been ready to fade, prepared to let the world pass him by, but now he had a reason to rise, to mend, to wait. The measure of trust was not just in the horse, it was in himself, and for the first time in years, Noah Briggs believed he could carry it. The nights had grown longer, the air sharp enough to cut when Noah Briggs stepped outside with his lantern. The pen loomed in the dark, its rails patched and braced, its corners scarred with the history of too many battles. Yet within its boundaries, the black stallion now stood not as a storm bound by steel, but as a shadow that chose to remain. Noah leaned on the fence, his limp worse from the day's labor, and let the quiet wrap around him. He had learned to read silence, to measure it like a man measures the weight of a rifle. Tonight, it carried a tension that was not fear but anticipation, the pause before something shifts. The stallion turned his head, eyes catching the faint glow of the lantern, and for the first time, Noah did not see defiance burning there. He saw recognition. He set the lantern on the ground, opened the gate with slow hands, and stepped inside. His heart thudded heavy, not with dread, but with reverence. The stallion did not rear, did not bolt. He watched, ears flicking, body still as stone. Noah walked halfway across the pen, then stopped. He held his ground, breathing slow, hands loose at his sides. The horse shifted, one great hoof pressing into the earth, then another. He closed the distance step by step until his breath warmed the air between them. Noah lifted his hand, palm open. The stallion's muzzle lowered, whiskers brushing skin. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it was real. Noah felt fire spark beneath his ribs, the fire of a bond tested by storms and silence, now tempered into something unbreakable. He whispered the name again, soft and sure, Valor. The horse flicked an ear, blew out a breath, and stayed. From that night forward, their work deepened. Noah introduced the sound of a rope coiled on his shoulder and the sight of a halter hanging loose in his hands. He never rushed. He let the stallion watch, let him decide. Each day, the animal allowed a little more. His muzzle touched the rope, his neck brushed against the halter, his eyes softened when Noah's voice filled the air. Trust was measured in inches, in heartbeats, in choices made and not undone. Word spread quickly, as it always did. Neighbors who once mocked began to drive past slowly, craning to catch glimpses of the horse they had called cursed. Some stopped at the fence, leaning on rails with folded arms, watching with awe, trying to disguise their interest as casual. They saw what no one had believed possible: a wild giant lowering his head to a man's hand without rage. Clint Rollins came one evening, his hat in hand, his eyes cautious but curious. He leaned on the fence as Noah stood inside the pen, brushing the stallion's neck with slow strokes. The great horse shifted his weight but did not strike, did not flee. Clint's voice carried across the rails, quiet but confident. "I never thought I would see that." Noah did not answer. He kept his hand steady, his breath even, his eyes on the animal who had chosen to stay. Clint nodded once, the kind of nod men give when words are not enough, then turned and left. Maggie returned as well, her kit in hand, her stethoscope glinting in the light. She watched from the gate, her sharp eyes tracing every detail of the stallion's posture. "His ears are softer," she said. "See the way his shoulder relaxes when you touch him. That is not a horse waiting to strike anymore. That is a horse learning how to stand with you." Noah's chest tightened at her words, but he only nodded. He knew better than to celebrate too soon. Trust was fragile, a fire that could burn bright but vanish with a single wrong move. Still, he felt it deep in his bones. They had crossed some unseen threshold. They were no longer strangers bound by necessity. They were something else. One night, weeks after the storm, Noah stood in the pen as dusk bled into darkness. He carried a saddle pad in his hand, worn and straightforward, smelling of leather and dust. He held it where the stallion could see, then lowered it slowly onto his arm. Valor's eyes tracked the movement, ears flicking, nostrils flaring. Noah did not force, did not demand. He simply stood until the horse stepped forward and sniffed the pad. That was enough. Noah let it rest there, unfastened, unclaimed, then lifted it away. The stallion did not rear, did not bolt. He snorted once, then stood calm. Noah's breath caught. A trial had been passed, quiet but profound. He left the pen with the pad in hand, his heart heavier than it had been in years, yet lighter than he remembered it could be. On the porch, he sat with the lantern burning low, his body aching, but his spirit fierce. He thought of scars hidden beneath hide, of battles fought in silence, of storms endured together. The trial of firelight had shown him the truth. Trust was not given in grand gestures, but in the small choices made in darkness. And with each one, he and Valor stepped closer to a bond that could not be broken. The last of winter's bite clung to the Wyoming air, but spring whispered on the horizon. Grass pushed green shoots through the soil, and the wind carried less of the cutting edge that had ruled the plains for months. Noah Briggs stood at the porch rail, his hands scarred and stiff, his leg aching as always, but his eyes rested on the pen with a steadiness he had not known in years. Valor grazed near the far fence, his massive frame dark against the pale sky, his movements calm, measured. Gone was the restless storm that had once shaken the rails and bent the posts. In its place stood an animal who had learned to breathe alongside a man who had almost forgotten how. Noah walked the lane, each step deliberate, his boots sinking slightly in soft earth. He carried no bucket this morning, no rope, no gear, only himself. The stallion lifted his head, ears pricking, nostrils flaring at the familiar sound. For a moment, the air held still, a reminder of the days when every approach meant danger. Then Valor walked forward, closing the distance with a steady confidence that had taken months to build. Noah opened the gate and stepped inside, his breath slow, his chest heavy with memory. He reached out his hand, palm open. The stallion pressed his muzzle against it, whiskers brushing skin, warmth meeting warmth. Noah let his fingers trace the thick neck, feeling the strength beneath, the pulse steady and sure. That simple act, once unthinkable, now felt inevitable. Trust had been forged in storms and silence, in patience and pain. It had not come quickly, nor easily, but it had come. The days that followed carried new trials. Noah introduced the halter, not as a command, but as an invitation. Valor accepted, shifting his head, letting the leather settle. The first time it buckled into place, Noah's heart pounded harder than it had in battle. He moved the horse a step left, a step right, and Valor followed, calm, sure. It was not control, it was conversation. The kind spoken without words, only trust. Neighbors came and watched, their faces lined with disbelief and awe. Some muttered of miracles, others of stubbornness rewarded. Children pointed, eyes wide, calling the giant horse gentle. Even Clint Rollins, the auctioneer who had nearly consigned Valor to the kill buyer, tipped his hat and said with quiet respect, "That horse is not what he was." But Noah knew better than to claim triumph. Trust was not a finish line, not a ribbon tied to a gate. It was work renewed each day, fragile as glass and strong as steel. Every touch, every breath shared was another step on a road with no end. By summer, Valor no longer lingered at the edges of the pen. He walked with Noah across open fields, his stride matched to the man's limp, his ears tuned to the steady rhythm of a voice that had once been nothing but background. Together, they patrolled fence lines, crossed shallow creeks, and stood beneath skies heavy with heat and memory. One evening, as the sun sank in flames along the horizon, Noah saddled Valor for the first time, not to ride far, not to conquer, only to stand with him, the leather creaking, the weight accepted without fight. He laid his hand on the withers, whispered steady words, and felt the great body relax under his touch. Then he swung up, slow and sure, and the stallion stood square, steady as stone. The ride was nothing dramatic, no gallop, no spectacle, only a walk across the field, 4 hooves carrying a steady rhythm, one man's hand resting firm on reins that did not pull. The wind carried the smell of sage, the cry of meadowlarks, and the sound of 2 beings moving as one. When they returned, Noah slid from the saddle, his boots sinking in soft earth. He removed the tack, brushed the sweat-darkened coat, and let his hand linger on the thick neck. Thor lowered his head, breath huffing against Noah's chest, eyes soft with a calm that had once seemed impossible. Noah whispered then, voice rough but sure, "We made it, not to perfection, not to some fairy tale ending, but to this, to quiet, to trust, to redemption that had been earned and not given." The night settled around them, the sky vast with stars, the land silent except for the sound of hooves shifting and a man's steady breath. Noah knew storms would come again, fences would break, and pain would return. But he also knew this bond would hold, not because it was easy, but because it had been forged in fire, in patience, in the scar beneath the hide that matched his own. In that quiet redemption, Noah found what he had thought was lost forever. A reason to stay, a reason to rise each morning, a reason to believe that even the fiercest storms could pass, leaving behind something more substantial than what had stood before. Valor grazed peacefully, tail flicking, head lowering to the grass. Noah leaned on the rail, his heart full, his scars no longer chains but reminders. The giant horse that no one had wanted had become his mirror, his companion, his hope. The world beyond the ranch would keep turning, filled with noise and doubt, but here in the quiet, man and horse had rewritten their story. And neither would ever be the same again.